some small group discussions so we can be finished in half an hour.
Sure.
Welcome to day 4 of the Future series. We are moving into our theme, Future Generations, and we've got David Reid from Fuel Change joining us to start us off with answering the question of how can we engage young people in our journey to net zero. So David, it's over to you for your initial thoughts on the question and to see where we end up.
Good morning and welcome everyone, whether you're online just now or you're watching this recording at some later date. Firstly, we'll still talk about fuel change in a minute. What I really want to discuss this morning about engagement is, I've been involved with the next generation for more than a year now, and my background is I'm a civil engineer, so don't hold that against me. So I'd spent 30 years working for a large corporate, Jacobs. So used to the corporate world, and a couple of years ago decided to do something different around climate change and around the next generation. What I actually thought was at the start of this journey, Tabitha, that the next generation were almost entirely bursting to be involved in climate change. That was my assumption. They were bursting to be involved, and all they needed was the platform, right? All they needed was a platform to be able to join in and do whatever it is they wanted to do. When I got there, actually, I found something completely different, something I didn't expect. And what I actually found was that most of them were disengaged, right? Most of the young people were disengaged, and they were disengaged because they didn't know how to engage. And the problem is too big, right? The problem is impossible, right? We can't make any difference because we don't know how we can make a difference. It's too late. It's almost inevitable that things are going to happen. So that for me was an eye-opener, right? I expected something quite different. And that set me thinking about fuel change and what we can do to properly engage this next generation of fairly disengaged individuals. That doesn't mean they were worried. They weren't worried. Absolutely, they were very concerned, expecting government or their employers or someone else to fix it because it's such a mammoth problem. So real engagement and true engagement, we think there's so much ongoing there, but the actual fact for young people, most of them, we've spent a bit of time in Larbert High. Larbert High is a big comprehensive school in Scotland, over 2,000 pupils, a real slice of the demographic from, every social background, every academic achiever that is in there. And in rough terms, what we found was there's probably 10% of the kids were on it, right? They were going to climate club and doing all of these things. But actually going to climate club was seen to be quite geeky, right? It wasn't cool. It's not cool. I'm talking about in the past tense. This is right now. So the next 20% were keen to do something, but they didn't know what, but they were keen, right? So they're there and ready to do something. The next 20% spoke about climate change, and whilst they spoke about it, they weren't really engaged in it. They were speaking about it because they felt they had to. The other 50% couldn't care, right? The other 50% didn't care at all. So what we found was actually this veneer of the 10% gives the feeling that young people are really engaged, they're on it, they're active. The reality is what we found was climate change in schools in particular and moving through into the next generation is quite a middle-class sport, right? It's quite a middle-class sport. We needed to work on how do we make this different? How do we make this for the masses? How do we find a way to have everybody from every walk of life part of it? So what I'd like to, I then reach back into some of my experiences, and I'm going to use a flip chart here, Tabitha. I hope you can see this. It'll move you a bit closer. Technology. So my background, I mentioned, was around civil engineering and the construction industry. And the construction industry, one of the biggest issues is safety, right? So bear with me for the next few minutes. and it all come together, right? I'm going to draw you a graph, right? Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Right. So this graph is safety statistics, and this is time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for safety statistics in the construction industry, this is everything above a paper cut. This isn't fatalities. This is everything above a paper cut, right? And over time, the construction industry has managed to get that graph down. Lots of, really poor safety record, driving it down to the point where it was much, much better. But what happened in the construction industry eventually is this line here got so far, but it just became a parallel line. They couldn't get to zero, right? Couldn't get safety to zero and no incidents. And this parallel line is a big issue in the safety world of construction. So I was part of Jacobs. I spoke about Jacobs, large construction organisation around the world. In 2005, there was a terrible disaster, right? BP oil refinery in Texas City, there was an explosion and 11 people died. The 11 people that died were all Jacobs people. They were all from Jacobs. They were my colleagues, right? I didn't know them, but it felt real. It felt really close to home. That 11 people that worked with me and my company were all killed on site. Worst is they weren't even on site doing work per se. They weren't operatives. They were in a porta cabin having a meeting about something completely different when something blew up next to them and killed them all. So at that point, it changed Jacobs as a company forever, right? It changed Jacobs because the executives at Jacobs had to go to 11 funerals, right? Had to go to 11 grieving households and speak to parents and kids about their loved one was lost. And that changed the company to the point where the executive says, we are never going to have this again. We are going to break this problem here, right? We are going to force ourselves to get from this parallel line to zero incidents, right? So in 2005, they launched a campaign called Beyond Zero. Like Beyond Zero was not just about closing this gap. Beyond Zero was a cultural change program that, if you imagine a 100 meters runner, 100 meters runners run through the line, they don't run up to the line and stop, right? So Beyond Zero was, let's go beyond zero in order to close this gap. And what did they do? Everybody around the world, the Jacobs, 70,000 people were engaged in that program, right? From the bottom up, that says, let's get engaged in safety. And lots of people were skeptical, right? Really skeptical that you could ever do this in the construction industry. But it was everywhere. Every meeting started with a safety discussion. Every meeting on site, every meeting in the office. We took it home, right? We encouraged everybody to take the message home, so in their home surroundings, they got their family involved in safety. We took it to clients, to suppliers, to say, this is something we're going to break the culture of. Now, 7 years later, right, in big parts of Jacobs, we got to zero. We got to zero incidents. This is everything above a paper cut, right? We managed to close this gap to the point where we got it to zero. So big parts of Jacobs, big sites, whole regions of the company got to zero, despite everybody saying you'll never get there, because it was true cultural change right in the DNA and the fabric of the business. Now I'm going to change this safety to emissions. I'm going to change that to carbon emissions, right? And if you look at the same graph, it's a pretty similar graph to the one we face right now. Here we've got 2030, right? Here we've got what we hope it globally is 2050. So 2030 globally, we're looking to get to 50%. In 2050, we're looking to get to zero globally. Now, the point with this is that first part, I think lots of people say we can achieve this, right? We can get that first part done by taking some of the low-hanging fruit. This second part here, though, right? This second part from 2030, 2050, that is much tougher. This is how we live our lives. This is cultural change, right? This is cultural change, how we live it, what we eat, how we travel, right? How we behave is going to be here. So in terms of fuel change, what we're working on, this is fuel change, right? That's what we're trying to do, fuel change, because we need right now to engage the next generation in order for this to have any chance of happening, to have a bottom-up approach so that young people, right, are really involved in the conversation. It's more than that. They need to be engaged in a way where we ask them for help, right? What we're doing at Fuel Change is we're going to, hundreds of young people in a very well-organized, structured manner and say, we don't want you just to tell us what you want. This is your future, right? You're going to inherit the impact of climate change. So let's get a bit of hope into this, right? Let's get a bit of hope. And the hope is that young people, when they're engaging, you ask them to help develop solutions for themselves. At the moment, we are giving them solutions. It was people like me that created this problem. So getting out there, engaging with young people who are currently disengaged and saying, we need your help, right? This is your future. So why don't you start to generate solutions that we can then implement and you take control of your future? Right? So now there's beginning to get a bit of hope when they're involved in that, a bit of faith that they've got the talent to come out with some of these solutions and develop them. Right? Bring the spark young people that bring to this conversation is amazing. Right? And we're talking about mainstream people, we're talking about every walk of life. So what we're doing at Fuel Change, Tabitha, is we're working really hard to work with apprentices, right? People from different sectors and backgrounds, people that aren't often asked the question of how can we tackle climate change? Because they all think they're a speck of dust that won't make a difference. They absolutely will. And once we get them jazzed up, once we get them in the challenge program, they're all engaged, right? They're really engaged. They think, right, I can make a difference. They've got hope and they've got faith and they've got spark, and they come out with amazing solutions. But the amazing solutions aren't the biggest thing. The biggest thing is they've been asked a question and they now realise that they can come up with answers. So now they're going back to their organisations and saying, give me our net zero plans, right? I want to know what we're doing about net zero, right? Give me the plans because we'll now drive it. So where we want to get to in Fuel Change, and this is what we're trying to do, is working with businesses to engage the masses of their operation, because when they're on it, they'll drive the net zero plan for the organisation. They'll take it somewhere, but that spark that comes from young people who say, I want to be involved in this and I can make a difference. And it's really getting traction now, Tabitha. So I encourage everybody to be involved in bringing, not just saying to young people, what do you think, we'll listen to you, because actually they're not listened to that often and they don't think they're listened to. Actually get them involved in the solutions to their own life. So at Fuel Change, our mantra is creating a carbon neutral future for the next generation, but designed by the next generation. And when we do that, we get real uptick, we get real traction. And the last bit I'll finish with, Tab, and then we'll open up for a wider chat, is what we have found is lots of young people obviously have got lots of habits already ingrained, right? Especially that 16 to 25-year-old, lots of habits already ingrained. So now we're reaching back into schools, and what we're finding is, again, most young people are saying, we haven't actually taught climate change and the impacts of it and what can be done correctly. We're not being taught it. We've lots of fantastic programs, which are awareness programs, but what they're not is embedded in the curriculum across all the subjects. This affects every part of our life. So we should teach it correctly, so young people truly understand the behaviours that they might take and they might form before their habits are truly formed. So when we get to 2030, right, you can imagine the youth of today, that's when they'll be running companies. That's when they'll be maybe starting their own their own career journey, right? So let's get on a journey where some of these behaviours are already ingrained, so we don't have to change them again, and they'll start to influence businesses and people around them to achieve what we need to achieve. So, you know, and just closing this segment, and we can go into a wider chat. Let's go out there properly, deal with the masses and not deal with, and by the way, the 10% and the 20% who are on it is fantastic, right? This is for everybody. But the people who aren't on it and they're not particularly engaged, we need to find a way to have them engaged, because this is their future. And the best way of doing that is actually by asking them to help solve some of the problems. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense, David. And what I'd like to do is just open it up to the floor for questions. So there's a lot in there of engaging the masses. I really like that, making climate change mainstream, embedding it throughout the curriculum. But I'm curious, what is coming up for people who've been listening? Rob.
So I really appreciated the chat. Thank you, David. What I noticed is that our presentations are quite aligned in that in the next session, I'm going to be talking also about the role of education in engaging students. What I noticed, though, you mentioned the sort of range of 16 to 24, 25. I wonder if we're almost not leaving it too late to embed those that drive for students, if it shouldn't be really engaged in the curriculum earlier.
Sorry, I should explain better. The challenge program I've spoken about, the challenge program that we run at Fuel Change is predominantly for 16 to 25-year-olds because they're already in the workplace, and we're giving them real life challenges set by industry so they can solve some of these problems in a very practical way, and then we can implement them. The piece I was talking about reaching back into schools, I entirely agree. So our foundations program in Fuel Change is about starting with S1s right through to S6, and that's in a Scottish context. So let's call it junior school and senior school. The junior school program is all about teaching climate change correctly and across all the subjects. So young people start to really understand the true implications. There's lots of myths out there, right? So we bust a lot of myths. But we also do it so that it's embedded in the curriculum, as opposed to, you know, sometimes there's a 2-week session. We're going to do the environment for 2 weeks, right? And then it disappears. But it needs to be right through the curriculum, consistently through every school. But also part of the program is, whilst we see that core educational piece being absolutely key, there's also a piece around about it, which is all the things that schools can actually do and make their own bespoke programs. It's like the practical application of what they're learning every day is, how do they get involved in doing things in their community, looking at jobs of the future, helping the school drive themselves to net zero themselves, but in a way that's quite practical. So they need that practical application as well as the core of teaching to make it all work. So that's how they form habits. Is where we're going with this. You know, we're not doing this because we made it up as well. You know, there's a lot of science behind this, as you would imagine, Rob. But we need to catch young people before they form their habits, or we'll be back in this situation in 7 or 8 years' time trying to change habits. For the senior school, it's as much about having them aligned to, they're looking at lots of jobs at the moment that are disappearing. We speak about just transition, and we speak about oil and gas as just transition. There's as big a just transition for young people who are looking at jobs that they might have expected to be involved in disappearing. So what's their just transition? Let's transition them to jobs of the future, which might not always be environmentally aligned, but for companies who absolutely are doing the right thing, who are absolutely embracing net zero plans, because their jobs are jobs that they should be aspiring to, because there will be lots of new jobs arrive. So that just transition is as much for our next generation as it is for the current generation. Does that make sense, Rob?
No, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much. I'll let other people ask questions, and I'm sure I'll have some follow-ups as well.
Jimmy, you've got your hand raised.
This has been my life. Seriously, I went from engineering into education and then entrepreneurship. I used to run one of the top young engineers clubs in the UK. In fact, my senior school, as David, as you mentioned, used to run the junior school club called the JETS, the Junior Engineers and Technologists. And it gave them project manager roles because they were managing a team of 4 youngsters. But we used the Small Peace Trust, and I noticed that Shona, she worked with Babcock. We used the Small Peace Trust for engineering residential courses. They cover every aspect of engineering, and it's for S2 and upwards. The big problem I found, I had to do everything. And the curriculum for excellence is supposed to do the very thing you just outlined in your fuel challenge. But there's so many diverse departments within a secondary school. They all protect their own. So the only way I could get the youngsters to see that they required a foreign language or English or maths or the science, the ability to, read, write and reason, was through an extracurricular club. And I found barriers everywhere to try and get other departments involved. But the great thing was the curriculum for excellence wanted these external links with companies. They wanted the youngsters to experience citizenship. And I took kids from one of the schemes in Glasgow, and the first words that they would say, I can't, and take them out of that environment just for a day or a weekend. And they very, very quickly realised that they could, and they were a damn sight better than most. Because they've had a lifetime of being told, you're rubbish, shut up, you don't know. They just get told that either at home or by their pals or even in some schools. I'd love, to be involved again. And that's what I like about this whole opportunity to network with the SBN, with the Net Zero group. The whole element is re-energizing me. I'm desperate to find out what Rob's going to say, because primary staff, they teach technology, but they don't call it that. They call it history. They call it geography. They don't realise that, history is a record of the technological development of previous, individuals. Geography is impact that, if you divert a river so that you build a canal to water the fields and things like that, that takes engineering, your civil engineers that you were talking about. But they don't talk about that. It's just history or geography. Until you point it out to them, you've got a big struggle ahead. And I sincerely hope that you manage to get through and change the whole mindset, because every secondary school, because of how good is our school, the measurement and getting graded and being the top school in the world or the country, gives, they close themselves off to everything else. I've just got to get results. I've just got to get results. I've just got to get results. And
you make a number of really good points, and I totally get them. If I go back to the schools piece first, you're absolutely right. What we've met with a lot of resistance that said, we're already doing this, thanks very much, right? And the fact is, schools are trying their hardest, but they don't have the information and all of the backup that allows them to teach it properly. So what we're doing is, we're working with teachers at the moment. We've got 20 schools involved in our pilot. So it's teachers who are developing plans for teachers. So as it stands, we've got something like a plan for 120 different lessons right through the school that gets into business studies, modern studies, English, art, and all of the things you wouldn't expect. So the way to get people to read in schools isn't to set up a reading club and it's only people that want to read that go along. So setting up a climate change club for all those that want to know about the climate, right, isn't going to get to the other 90% who are not going to go to climate clubs. So having it infused through every subject in a way that becomes, because that's who our life is going to be, right? Our life is going to be different, right? So when you're at home economics at the moment, well, let's start talking about food production and where you might get that. Is it going to be local now? How do we start to look at our diet in a different way? The other area in the jobs of the future, Jimmy, is, and I love the piece you said about lots of people saying, well, we can't do stuff. What's been completely energizing about fuel change is we're working with lots of apprentices, right? Going back to that, they've now left school. Lots of apprentices who have never been asked the question of how do you solve this? Something they've never worked on before. And I was talking about hope and faith and spark. My goodness, have these young people not given me a spark, right? The solutions they've come out with are amazing, right? The talent that we've got and these young people, untapped talent, because they don't think they can be involved, they don't know how to be involved, and some of them don't think they've got the aptitude and talent to do something amazing. And I love the fact that we've now got mainstream youngsters, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, talking about climate change in a whole new way, right? This could be my job of the future. I can imagine me working here. I can imagine me being part of a repair shop, right? Because repair is going to be a big part of the circular economy. Well, I could do that, right? I could definitely do that. Jimmy, you were good enough to come along last week to our session at the Arnold Clark Centre, which was about creatives, marketing and PR people. So, we asked a whole bunch of 16 to 25-year-olds again in the PR sector to come up with a campaign which was entirely aimed at their own demographic. So they're professionals in the business, and they went off to come up with 4 outstanding campaigns. They only worked together for 6 weeks. They've never met each other before. But in 6 weeks, they created 4 amazing campaigns. The winning campaign was voted on by young people from around the world who were watching on Instagram. And the winning campaign, which is called Off Season, is now going to be presented at the New York Times Climate Hub next week to an audience from a fashion background, etc. But again, the spark and enthusiasm of young people who almost surprised themselves at what they'd achieved in 6 weeks was amazing. And that's how we get engagement. Ask the next generation to solve it for themselves because they can do stuff.
I agree.
Right?
I agree 100%.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that question and the answer, David. I just want to let people know who are muted and off camera as well, that if you want to ask any questions, you can ask questions in the chat box. Are there any other questions coming up on the call? Juliet.
I really love this notion of engaging the youth and actually being able to go to schools and really trying to bring out all of these ideas and giving them hope. Because I personally remember that when I was in high school, the way that we were taught about climate change was always in a very negative perspective. We were given all the data and we were never really told how we could help as individuals with the fight against climate change. So I really love all these campaigns that you're doing. And I was just wondering, how many schools have you reached out to? How big is your network? And if you were thinking about maybe spreading it across the UK or even beyond?
So firstly, in terms of our programme, I haven't explained fuel change fully. My job here wasn't to fully explain fuel change. My job was to talk about how we engage the next generation. But our plan in fuel change, I was really lucky, right? I've had a great career. I was fortunate all the way through. I had people who believed in me all the way through my career. So what that brought me was working for a multinational. Then my background is working globally, right? Across borders, across cultures. So when we started Fuel Change, I said, whilst we're going to do this in Scotland, and we're going to do it well in Scotland and find out if it works, like a startup, right? A startup business. If it doesn't work, pack it in and go and do something else, right? So thankfully, what we've found is there is an area for Fuel Change to work in that will make a big difference. Scotland's only 0.08% of global emissions, right? We're a rounding error in Scotland, actually, in global emissions. But what we do have in Scotland is we have a rich history and a great network globally where we are trusted to take, innovation and invention around the world. We've got lots of places to reach out to. So the ambition at Fuel Change is pretty straightforward. We want to have Fuel Change cells, as we might call it, in at least 30 countries around the world doing exactly the same, right? Engaging young people, right? Doing exactly the same. So we start to build up a network of a next generation who will then give them a platform to speak right across the planet, across boundaries and borders, and start to share some of their experiences and also their solutions, right? Because they'll be coming up with solutions all the time. They'll make good solutions great by working together in a different way, and that's our ambition. Our ambition is once we've created the core and the wheel, as we call it, around the schools, our ambition is to be in 10,000 schools globally, right? Because that's the sort of level we're going to have to achieve if we're actually going to make a difference here, right? Doing it nicely in Scotland, whilst it'll be a good thing, it's not going to change the world. It will only change the world if we take what we're doing and we reach out, which is why, Rob's involvement in Hungary is amazing. But we're also, we've got someone set up in Connecticut, over in the States, someone in California. We've now opened up with India. The New York Times Challenge I mentioned, we've reached out to China. So we're now beginning to go somewhere, only because we need to. We need to take this approach and get young people right across the planet being involved in creating the solutions for their own future and properly teaching, climate in every school we possibly can. Our mantra is going to be every school, every workplace, everywhere, because we need to.
Thank you. I honestly really love that. I personally went to French international schools abroad, and my parents were teachers, so we moved around a lot. And I just noticed that no matter where we were, it was always the exact same mindset with regards to climate change. It was always just very negative, just like Rob said in the comments as well. It was always taught as an abstract concept. We were just told that like only scientists would be able to resolve climate change. So the fact that you're really trying to engage young people across the world, I think that's just a great project.
And one of the things we did learn is it's not until, so I'm 55, right? I know you think I'm probably a lot younger, but I'm actually 55, right? So I do a terrible thing, right? Is I'm doing exactly the wrong thing by making up solutions for yourself, right? For that next generation. I've got a 21-year-old son. So I employ him a lot to tell me to think differently. But with a really good paper, we've got a lad, Angus Job, who's over in Connecticut. He's a 22-year-old philosophy graduate. And he wrote us a paper which was brilliant. The paper said, here's what our life's like, right? When we were born into the climate crisis, we don't know anything else. I wax lyrical about how my life used to be, but you've never lived that life. So why am I telling you about that? And then he said, look, he says, when you were young, he said to me, he said, you had Star Trek and all of these futuristic programs that felt quite exciting, right? That the future is going to be really exciting and we're going to go to different places. He said, we've grown up with Avatar, right? But there's no air left, right? We've grown up with the Hunger Games where we're going to fight each other for food. We've got, right? So that's what we've grown up with, a really pretty negative outlook in life. So how do we turn that into a real positive, right? Because the future could be, and it should be massively positive, but only if we give you the chance to create it. And that's where we're hope, faith, spark, and a bit of youthful swagger, right? There's a word in Scotland we use called gallus, right? Which is just a wee bit of confidence and a bit of swagger to go and get stuff done. So we want a wee bit of Gallus involved what we're doing, and then take us there properly. If every organisation around the world, they're 25-year-olds and under, right, we're all switched on, then getting to net zero would happen, because it would be driven bottom up, and that's what we need.
Thanks very much for that, David. I think Jimmy's got his hand up again, and we've got time for one more question, comment or feedback, Jimmy, before we wrap up.
Sorry, then very, very quickly. David, my email's at the bottom end of my picture there. You'll see it. Have a wee look, both Robert and David and everybody else, have a wee look at the F1 in schools. In the early 90s, I helped them launch F1 in schools, where the kids design and build a CO2 powered vehicle. And it brought in CAD systems, a whole shooting match. But Bernie Ecclestone put £1 million into it. And now the top teams from around the globe, Singapore, America, everywhere, they actually meet at an F1 circuit whenever there's a big event on, the Malaysian Grand Prix or something like that. And the youngsters do their presentations there. It's worth it, particularly for the fact that you're trying to be economical with fuel or looking at alternative methods. It gets the kids into designing vehicles and things, because we used to take part in the American Young Engineers in the early 90s, from 93 to 98. And it was great fun taking kids across to the American Young Engineers and participating. And in one case, we finished second to the top teams in the States. And that was just school kids from Springburn. They got.
I'll follow through, and that's a fantastic.
Take my email. We need to chat. And the last wee thing, I'm obviously trying to get 10.2 in through my Rotary network, because there's Interact clubs in schools where they're trying to do good in the community. This is giving you an opportunity to get them involved, because they do have a technology competition in the Interact, which is the secondary school Rotary for 12 to 17. Tabitha, again, I've got to thank you very much for giving me a profile. Absolutely brilliant. David, Robert, I'm looking forward to what you're going to say. David, thanks very much.
No, thank you, Jimmy.
Can I quickly ask, just is there what is the URL for the website for Fuel Change?
I'll drop you one over to everyone, actually.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And we can put it under the recording as well, so that if you're watching this on the recording, you can look below and there'll be a link to Fuel Change below.
Yeah, can I also put my hands up and say our website could be better, right? So we're making it better. And we've been running on a shoestring, right? And so website keeps coming up as a priority about number 3, but it's never got to number 1. So our website will be full of amazing stories of the next generation pulling up trees in the fullness of time.
Get the kids to design it.
Absolutely. That is a great shout. We should practice what we preach. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for giving your time, David. I know it's a busy schedule for you in the midst of COP26, so we appreciate you being here. We appreciate everybody who's been here live. Thank you very much. And we will be back with more conversations on future generations. Thank you.
And thank you.